Hi, hello. Here's the story. A few years ago now, I got this random set of reeves watercolors from my grandma. She just happened to have them lying around. I don't know why. I don't think she knows why. Either way, she wasn't using them, so she let me take them, and at the time, it seemed pretty reasonable that I would one day just film a Reeves watercolor review, but in the meantime, the Reeves Art Supplies brand seems to have just dropped off the face of the earth? I don't know what's up with that. If you do, please tell me. Anyway, I decided to table that idea since it didn't seem particularly useful to review an art supply that no one can actually purchase, but I've sort of been looking for an excuse to use them ever since then, and then about a month or two ago, if you're sensing a trend here, I start something or I do something, but I don't quite complete it and it just sits around unfinished for a while until I either come back for it or forget about it entirely. So yeah, you might be sensing a trend here. I did come back for this one though, because I filmed and edited an entire YouTube video, and I'm not about to just let all that work go to waste, just because I was too scared to record a voiceover. I was scared. I am scared. I'm so scared, guys. Anyway, back to a month or two ago, I realized that I could actually use this random, probably discontinued Reeves watercolor set to answer a question that's been plaguing me for years. Are cheap watercolors actually worth it? Wow, title drop! Moving on. One of the things you hear recommended a lot when you look to learn a new medium is to just buy a cheap set to see if you like it. But this seems like pretty good advice in theory. Nobody wants to waste money. I've always kind of wondered if the quality is good enough to actually give you a fun painting experience in your cheap art supplies, or will the quality be bad enough that the painting isn't fun and then you don't think you like watercolors. The problem isn't you or the watercolors, but the specific shitty paints that you happen to buy. So, rather than talking about the quality of the paint directly, although I'm still going to be doing that a little bit, I'm going to use the Reeves watercolors as sort of a stand-in for the general category of low-end student watercolors, like the Arteza, Meeden, Ohuhu, random Amazon paint brand that you've literally never heard before in your life, kind of thing. So, like you just saw, I poured the paints into a palette so I could sort of see how they dry and then how they reactivate. Don't worry, I didn't get a palette explicitly for these paints or anything. Although this particular palette was really cheap, it was $5, and then I got it on sale for an additional 20% off. It was great. I'm really excited about it. Anyway, I just happened to have it, and I thought it would be fun to do a palette pouring. I did peel the dried up paint out of the palette after I was done with it, and I'm going to be using this palette for a little fun project that will hopefully go up on the channel eventually. If you remember that trend from earlier, we'll see. Anyway, there was a bit of a weird problem with binder separation that you can see me sort of wipe up a few times, but overall the paint was fine and palette pouring was fun! And then I let them dry and swatched them out in my sketchbook. They dried up a little hard and they were a little hard to reactivate overall, and then there was some variation between specific colors, like the reds in particular weren't great, which made me quite nervous because I find red to be quite an important color, and that orange was really nice. The swatches in general turned out a little chalky, and they didn't knock my socks off vibrancy-wise, but, they were fine. So, while I'm painting this little sketch, how about we move on to the sort of broader subject of this video? Would I recommend buying a cheap set of watercolors to a beginner who is looking to get into watercolor painting? And well, I guess my answer is, it's complicated? The alternative piece of advice you sort of get is to buy a few higher quality paints in the primary colors because it will cost you about the same amount of money and you'll end up with better paint. I sort of agree with this one, but again, it's complicated. Generally speaking, if you already know how to mix colors, if you're an oil or acrylic or gouache painter and you want to try out watercolors, I would say buy some primaries. It's better, the paint is better. Better paint is more fun to paint with. I think that's pretty obvious. But if you're a beginner, maybe you're a digital artist, or a marker artist, or a pencil crayon artist, or you've just never seriously colored a piece of art in your life, then that's where the whole "it's complicated" thing kind of comes in. Mixing paint and getting the colors you want is hard. It's scary, and having all the colors that a full set of paint provides you with makes it a lot less scary to get the colors you want. I think the most important thing about supplies for beginners is making it the least scary to get started as possible, and then making it as easy as possible to have a good time while you're painting, and then in combination with that, make some art that you like. If you don't know how to mix colors, then having a lot of colors could be the thing to make painting less scary and more fun. But this ultimately sort of brings us back to the same question, or I guess the original question of supply quality and how much it matters, which ties back into the review of these paints that I'm kind of doing. Anyway, I painted a couple things for this video: the sketch that you're seeing now, the painting in the thumbnail that you'll see later, and a hand, which I didn't film, but I'll show a photo of that when it is relevant. So, for reference, also, I used the Curry's own brand brushes that I bought when I was, I think, 13 for all the paintings. You saw me hold them up to the camera. I also used my sketchbook. It's the Ohuhu Mixed Media Sketchbook. I like it a lot. And then for the portrait in the thumbnail, I used Fabriano Studio watercolor paper. I wanted to use supplies that were in a similar sort of place, quality or price-wise, but I also wanted to use things that I already owned, since I think it would be wasteful to buy new stuff. And here we are. So, I like all the things that I painted. I had a reasonable amount of fun painting them. I know how to paint, and I would like to think, I hope that I'm pretty good at it. Although I do think that's, ultimately up for you to decide. I'm telling you this because I don't want to be blaming these paints for work I don't like. I do like these paintings. It's just that, the experience of painting them wasn't, flawless across the board positive. The dried paint, it dries hard, and it's hard to re-wet. And you do have to put in a little bit of effort to get color out of your dried paint blobs. Obviously, that's not a deal breaker, it's just a little bit more annoying. Kind of going hand in hand with this is that the paint isn't all that pigmented, you don't get that much color relative to the amount of paint you're using. And this is annoying when your paint doesn't reactivate well, because you have to put in a lot of work to get your paint to re-wet, and do that more times in order to get enough paint to then paint with. This mostly comes into play when you're mixing colors. I used the Payne's Gray color and the Alizarin Crimson color straight from their little blobs, and I was able to get fairly dark color for the witch's hat. Anyway, for this particular sketch, the lack of pigment doesn't really matter. I'm painting a light-colored subject and then doing line work afterwards. If you're painting pastel subject matter with line art, I'm sure you wouldn't run into that problem. So, moving on to what I guess is the main portrait, I decided to use fresh paint so I wouldn't have to worry about the reactivation problem, and so I would have the best possible chance of having bright colors. But I ultimately still ran into the lack of pigment problem. It felt like a lot of extra work, and I had to use a lot of paint in order to paint the single dark element in this piece. If I was painting a dark background or a darker skin tone, this would be amplified. I painted this hand just as a tester sketch to see what that would be like, and obviously I was able to do it. This is a dark skin tone that I painted, but to get the really deep shadows, I was using a lot of paint, and pretty thickly for watercolor, and that's both an unpleasant experience, and I do think the end product kind of suffers a little bit, and I think that's a shame. It's worth considering when it comes down to the little annoyances of using this paint is that, for me personally, this wasn't a difficult painting. I know how to paint a portrait, and therefore I never really struggled with painting it, and as a result of that, I was never really frustrated. But if I was working on a more difficult painting, and if I was frustrated about that process, it would make things a lot worse to then also be frustrated with how the paints are working. Painting is hard, and I don't think that supply should make it harder. And on a similar note, when beginner artists are already fed this myth that darker skin tones are harder, or I guess more complicated to do, and also with the underlying existence of colorism, I don't think beginners need an additional excuse to not paint dark skin tones, Anyway, so yeah, it is complicated, but to be honest, I think that buying a higher quality of paint at the start is worth it. I do understand that color mixing is scary and confusing. It definitely was when I first started painting. And, it low-key changed my life when someone told me that skin tones are just lighter or darker and less saturated versions of orange. I understand that a cheaper set of paints has a lower skill floor, but it also has a much lower skill ceiling. If you buy a cheap set and then you do like watercolor, the process of also upgrading your watercolors involves buying an entirely new set of paint. Whereas a set of primaries has a slightly higher skill floor, but then a pretty infinite skill ceiling. And if you buy good paints from the beginning and then end up liking watercolors, then the process of upgrading your watercolors is basically just buying more colors rather than having to replace anything. Art supplies are an investment. I'm sure you've heard that before. But you don't necessarily need to invest in everything. It all depends on your personal priorities, and I understand that a big upfront cost can be prohibitive to prohibitive to starting something. You should do what works for you and your budget, and you certainly shouldn't feel lesser because of the quality of your art supplies. At the end of the day, painting is supposed to be fun, and I think you should pick the supply that sounds like it'll be the most fun for you. And that's it. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your opinion on cheap watercolors. I hope to make more videos, so please subscribe if you'd like to see more. Thank you. Okay, like Loki, that sounds like an answering machine. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more. Thank you. Beep. This is not like the satisfying. Oh. This is not the satisfying pill pouring experience I was hoping it would be. Like, why did I wait several days to film this? When it's literally so shit. Oh my god. Oh, it's fine. It's just the tape ribbing. It's fine. We're fine here. This is fine. Everything's fine. Doesn't sound fine. Does not sound fine. You know, after all that, even though it's been like, now it's been weeks, it looks pretty good. Like, pan. It's not a pan, because I'm moving my body. Yeah, we don't need to go. Yeah, like...